Broadly, the Foundations Forum has two main goals here on campus. First, to catalyze the dialogue between people of diverse religious and non-religious perspectives within our university community. And second, to set an example on how that dialogue can be conducted with mutual respect. This being the third year of the forum, we felt comfortable setting our sights on a particularly controversial topic. There's an unspoken rule around the Thanksgiving dinner table that two things are never to be discussed with in-laws: politics and religion. What we have done is taken these two topics and combined them into a single event. Specifically, our question is how religious and non-religious perspectives ought to enter into public life, with emphasis on political dialogue, voting, and policy. Controversial questions like these are often very difficult to discuss, but at the same time, that controversy makes them all the more significant when they do occur. And so we ask that you would join with us tonight in engaging with this discussion in a respectful way.
My name is Carolyn. I'm representing Roundtable Discussion Group. And I just wanted to encourage all of you to stick around after the discussion is over, hang out in the lobby, and find someone to talk about the discussion with, preferably someone with a viewpoint different from your own. There will be refreshments provided for this as well. In addition, Roundtable will be hosting follow-up discussions the next few Friday evenings, starting tomorrow evening. You can grab a flyer from Roundtable with the information about that after the discussion, and there will be food provided there as well.
Hi, I'm Alice from Campus Atheists, Skeptics, and Humanists. So to start off our night, our speakers will each give a brief opening statement, and then we will go on to 30 minutes of discussion, and then after that there will be a 30-minute Q&A. During the discussion, we encourage audience members to write down any questions they may have and pass them to the ends, to the colorful baskets at the ends of your rows. So to introduce our secular speaker, we have Rebecca Markert. She is a legal director for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. She graduated from Roger Williams University School of Law in 2008, and she works on cases regarding the First Amendment and the public and government.
And then our first speaker for the evening will be Michael Ware. Michael is the founder of Public Square Strategies, LLC, and directed Obama's faith outreach for his 2012 re-election campaign. His new book, Reclaiming Hope, is available most anywhere books are sold. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hello, I'm Salahuddin from the Muslim Student Association, and I'm tasked with introducing our moderator for tonight. The moderator for tonight is Dr. Muhammad Khalifa. He is the Robert H. Beck Professor of Ideas in Education in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy and Development at the University of Minnesota. He is most noted for helping districts perform equity audits as a way to address injustice and dehumanization in schools, and has helped leaders select appropriate reforms that counter inequitable practices in schools. His research examines how school leaders enact culturally responsive leadership practices, and he has published in a wide array of top educational journals. His forthcoming book, Cultural Responsive School Leadership, is forthcoming in Harvard University Press, and he is a former district administrator and science teacher in Detroit Public Schools, and is also a leading expert in educational reform in African and Asian contexts.
Well, good evening, everybody. As Salah just introduced myself, I'm Dr. Muhammad Khalifa, and we're very thrilled to have two special guests with us. As noted, each one will be given a 10-minute opening statement, and then I have just a few questions before we turn to our audience. So thank you so much for both being with us. So Rebecca, why don't we start with you for 10 minutes?
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be part of this annual event that brings up such great discussions and dialogues that will continue on throughout the academic year. I do think that the student organizers need to be particularly commended for tonight's topic. It's pretty fun for me, but you know, the cardinal rule that Ryan alluded to was that you never discuss religion and politics if you want to have a civil discussion. But truth be told, my family never adhered to that rule. I grew up in a Catholic family in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So our Thanksgiving dinners were full of discussion about religion, politics, and the Packers. I relished the opportunity to meet with my family and discuss these topics. I also fondly remember when I went to one of these family gatherings and my uncle, who was a Catholic priest, came up to me and said, "So I saw your name in the news." Now, I had been working for Freedom from Religion Foundation for a number of years at this point, so everybody knew where I stood on things, but I wasn't quite sure where he was going with this. But I had an inkling. Just a few weeks prior, I had written a letter to the IRS about the bishop who had been engaging in some electioneering, endorsing candidates from the pulpit, and sending letters to everybody in the diocese about who they should vote for. So I thought, well, this is probably what he's going to bring up. But I said, "Oh yeah?" And he said, "Yes, atta girl." So the point is, you can have a civil discussion about religion and politics, even if you don't agree on things. There is always something that you can agree on. My uncle, who was a priest, didn't believe that the church should be politicking. And even though we disagree on a lot of other things, we could agree on that. And if that fails, there's always the Packers. But you can always find common ground, and you can go on continue to like each other. Obviously, I can't participate in this panel discussion without discussing my work at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, for those of you who don't know, is a national organization based in Madison, Wisconsin. They work to protect the constitutional principle of separation between state and church, and also to educate the public on matters related to non-theism. We're a membership organization. We have 32,000 members across the country, including members in every single state, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. And I'm the legal director, so I deal with the first part of our mission, which is to keep state church separate. To that end, we field about 4,500 to 5,000 complaints a year where people believe that the First Amendment was violated. Not all of those complaints result in action, but a lot of them do. Most of them involve religion in the public schools. So coaches praying with their students, teachers teaching their kindergartners how to pray before snack time. Cross displays at customer service counters at government offices. One in particular involved a 30 cross display at a tax assessor's office. Two of the crosses included John 3:16. And they were not part of a private cubicle. They were in the customer window facing the customers who were coming up to the tax assessor's office. Also Christian flags at government buildings and other types of religious displays. We try to stop these violations. We do that mostly through education, where our team of attorneys, we have 9, write to the government entity and ask them to remedy the violation. We educate them about the law, advise them on how they could stop it, and ask them to do just that. We don't want to sue, but we often have to. And over the last 2 years, we are 15-3 in our lawsuits. And some of those numbers might change because of appeals, but we're still pretty excited about our record in keeping religion out of our government. Since I've been on staff, and really since I've been involved in the secular movement, there's been tremendous growth. And we need to talk a little bit about that. When I started at FFRF, we had about 10,000 members. That was back in 2008. Today we stand at 32,000, and those numbers keep going up. Just a few months ago, we were only at 26. So they are growing. Now, of course, those are dues-paying members. I'm not including our supporters. We have many, many more on Facebook and Twitter, and other people who just come to events like these and tell me, oh, I should become a member. But the point is, our growth is reflecting the growth across the country. More and more Americans are becoming non-religious. So there was a study from the Public Religion Research Institute in September of last year that revealed that nearly a quarter of Americans are now religiously unaffiliated, and nearly 30% are non-Christians, so either practicing a minority religion or none at all. These numbers are even greater when you look at the younger generation. There was a study by the Barna Group just last month that pointed out that atheism is more prevalent with Generation Z, that means kids who were born between 1999 and 2015, than ever before. That study found that 21% of Generation Z identifies themselves as atheist or as agnostic. And that is a profound increase. Most of the studies that you see when people are identifying themselves as atheist or agnostic, that is in single digits. So for Generation Z to be up at 21%, that's amazing. An additional 14% of Generation Z identifies themselves as non-religious. So that's a huge number. 35% of the country is either not believing in a God or doesn't consider themselves religious. So I bring these statistics up because they're incredibly important when we're looking at tonight's topic. A couple of reasons. Obviously, they show that the voice of the non-religious and the non-believing need to be represented in our halls of government, particularly in Congress. And we're underrepresented in Congress. Pew's Faith on the Hill survey that was done in 2017 found that 91% of the members identified themselves as Christian. It's not surprising, obviously. But just one member of Congress, Representative Sinema from Arizona, identifies herself as unaffiliated. And in fact, in our history, there was only one open atheist in Congress, Pete Stark. He's no longer in Congress. He lost in 2012, but he served for over 3 decades. And it wasn't until he was serving in Congress and felt that his seat was pretty safe that he announced that he didn't believe in God. Nobody in the history of our country has run as an avowed atheist. They've not entered the race saying, I don't believe in God. There are undoubtedly people who are serving in Congress that don't believe in God, but they don't want to share that personal information. It's the kiss of death in politics. In the same study, Pew found that 50% of respondents say they'd be less likely to vote for a presidential candidate who said they didn't believe in God. 10 members of Congress, of the current Congress, declined to answer the question, including Representative Jamie Raskin, who represents Maryland. And he is a really big friend to the secular movement. He's a former con law professor, former state representative, who famously told another representative while he was in the state Senate that you put your hand on the Constitution, or you put your hand on the Bible and swore to uphold the Constitution. You didn't swear to uphold the Bible. But still, when pressed on the question, he said, I'm emphatically Jewish. The numbers in state legislatures and local governments are slightly higher, but it's not hard to be higher than 0. And I don't have the statistics on that. I just know that in the November 2016 election, there were a lot of free thinkers, so people who identified themselves as atheist, agnostic, skeptic, humanist, what have you, being elected around the country. So those trends will be showing too. The second reason these stats are important is because they also show that this segment of the population can't be ignored anymore. It's the fastest growing segment of the American population by religious identification. Elected officials can't afford to ignore the rights and views of non-believers in this country. They just can't. So our overall question tonight, how should religious, agnostic, and atheistic views be expressed in American civil dialogue? Well, we know that their voices should be included in the American civil dialogue. And we'll discuss a little bit later how we can do that. But I do want to make one thing clear at the outset of this discussion, and that is Atheists and agnostics and my group, FFRF, we're not advocating for atheism to reign supreme in this country. We're not advocating for an atheist government. We want a secular government. I just spent the greater portion of this week in Washington, D.C., lobbying the Hill for just that, a secular government. Now, what does that mean and how does that look? I'm going to give you a very simplistic example. And because we get a lot of complaints about religion in the public schools, it's going to involve that, a public school coach praying with his team.
Rebecca, you have, your time has expired, but I will allow 1 more minute.
Oh, thank you, sorry. So the public school coach, he is a government employee. So in a Christian nation, he would go out to the team and say, Jesus is the Lord our God, go play football. In an atheist government, that same coach would say, there is no God, go play football. In a secular society, secular government, they would just say, go play football. So our basis of government is a godless one. Our Constitution is godless. There are only a few references to religion in the Constitution. They're all exclusionary. So you need to keep that in mind as we go on today. Secular government is a prerequisite for true religious freedom. You can't have religious freedom. You can't have freedom of religion without freedom from religion. So I'm looking forward to talking more about these points tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. And Michael, 10 minutes for yourself.
Great. Well, really wonderful to be here with you. Thank you for moderating, and Becky, it's been great to spend time with you and meet you. And great to be with all of you. It's my first time in Minneapolis. Was hoping I'd get an invite to the Super Bowl, but this is a good second option. We're here to consider how religious perspectives ought to be expressed in the public square, particularly in the context of American politics. And I just want to use my 10 minutes or so to, and the or so is less than, to just put some parameters and put some framework and ideas out there about that. First point I want to make is to identify the assumption in the frame that we've set out, which is an assumption that for an array of cultural and political reasons is often used instead as an open question, as a point for debate. But it is impractical and manipulative to set out that religious people cannot participate in the public square as religious people. It is contrary to the idea of a participatory form of government. It is an attempt to stack the deck, to preclude one's opponents or perceived opponents from even entering our public debates, to end the debate before it begins. But the assumption in our question is that religious perspectives will be a part of our public dialogue, and the question is how are those best lived out? It's important to note, America is still a profoundly religious nation. So religious disaffiliation is on the rise, but if 30% do not affiliate with a religion, that means 70% still do. So for all of the decades of headlines on the cover of Newsweek, God is dead, for all of the newspapers that have reported a religious decline, it's important to understand, particularly in the Western world, the United States is an outlier in terms of secularization so far. There are some academics who believe that we're on a trajectory like Western Europe, but even so, we're decades behind where Western Europe is. And so America is still a profoundly religious nation. And it's a politics that excises religious expression would be inherently undemocratic in spirit, if not formally. This is what led then Senator Obama to say in 2006 in a speech that secularists are wrong when they ask believers to leave their religion at the door before entering into the public square. Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, indeed the majority of great reformers in American history were not only motivated by faith, but repeatedly used religious language to argue for their cause. So to say that men and women should not inject their, quote, personal morality into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of morality, much of it grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That was Senator Obama in 2006. It would also require us to ignore American history or to discard as improper some of the most formative social movements in American history. To turn to Senator Obama, again, he said in that same speech, imagine Lincoln's second inaugural address without reference to the judgments of the Lord, or King's I Have a Dream speech without references to all of God's children. Their summoning of a higher truth helped inspire what had seemed impossible and moved the nation to embrace a common destiny. Thankfully, we're not having that conversation today. I don't think. We are assuming that citizens can bring their whole selves to the project of self-governance. And so once we have decided to forego the manipulative tactic of disqualifying certain kinds of knowledge from public applicability, then we can have a more realistic, helpful conversation about how religious perspectives ought to behave in public, in the words of one Oxford professor. I should note, first, there are few actual legal restrictions at play here in terms of the nature of the message, though there are a bit more when it comes to the messenger. So we're not speaking primarily here about what is legal, but rather what is advisable, what is edifying. I'll also state that I believe this conversation is very much shaped by our laws, our society, our history, and our traditions. So we cannot necessarily discuss this question in the same way in our context as we would in another. Let me close with just a few characteristics of a healthy expression of religiously motivated views in a political context. First, healthy religious expression will be authentic. The speaker will mean what they say. A healthy public discourse would not compel one to affirm truths that they do not hold, nor would a participant committed to healthy political discourse affirm truths that they do not believe as a political tactic. So Rebecca is absolutely right on this point, that a healthy politics would not compel people who do not believe in God to claim a belief in God. This, of course, does not mean that that only people of a certain religion can address people of their religion in the religious terms that they share, or that secular people can only address secular people in secular terms. In 2016, we saw Bernie Sanders warmly received at Liberty University, the largest evangelical university in the country, where Bernie spoke authentically from his perspective in a way that was relevant to that evangelical audience. Catholic Ted Kennedy did the same about 35 years earlier. And religious political leaders, of course, often by choice and by necessity, address audiences that do not share their beliefs and knowledge about ultimate reality. This is not inconsistent with authenticity, but with pluralism. What is critical is that we are able to have a level of trust that we are dealing with people as they are. Second, healthy religious expression will tend to be interpretive rather than declarative. They will contribute to an argument, not shut one down, particularly in a pluralistic society. And so again, there's no legal guidance to say that a citizen in the public square cannot say in a public debate, the Bible says so and therefore. What I am setting forth is the idea is that is not the healthiest way to engage as a religious person in a debate. That sort of sheer claims that appeal solely to the authority of one's religious tradition in a pluralistic setting can tend to be disrespectful of the audience. It can claim to an authority that the speaker knows that the audience does not share. This does not mean that religious ideas cannot be drawn upon in public debate, but that those should be interpretive, not declarative, and maybe we'll get a bit more into that. And then third and finally, the invocation of religion in public discourse and in political discourse will be to help people, not shame them or prop up oneself. This is an idea I hope we'll discuss a bit more, but the principle is pretty clear that the intent of the speaker in speaking should be to help their audience and to be part of a mission of mutual and joint inquiry, rather than using the language of religion to discount some and lift others up. And so I'll close with that, but really looking forward to our conversation. Thanks.
See, both of you, you've gone and done it now. We've got a debate on our hands. So I'll start the first question with asking about this notion of privilege. And I'm a race scholar, and so a lot of times when we talk about race, it's very painful. It's a very painful history in this country. So you find people coming to the conversation differently. Some people come and they'll say things like, I don't see race. And others will come and they'll say, I'm a white, hetero, cis, man, male. Not as though just because you kind of describe yourself that that's supposed to shift the privilege that you hold. So when you come, as a secularist, when you come to conversations like this, and you say we should not acknowledge how anybody stands, I guess this notion of privilege for you, I would ask, how do we ignore the history and the clear advantages that some people have? And in other words, how do you deal with the pain? How do you deal with the privilege? How do you deal with the advantages that some people have if you come and say, hey, we're all secularists, right? And I guess to ask you the same question, how can you come and just by acknowledging religion but not acknowledging the privileged position and the power that kind of entails? And by the way, in your response, take time to kind of, respond to each other if you like.
Sure.
Can you?
So I think this is a difficult question, and a particular poignant one at this time. I feel that oftentimes we will be told that atheism is sort of privileged in this country, and I would disagree with that premise. The people who are atheists may be privileged. It's a fact that most atheists are white men, older white men. But the perspective is certainly not. So the idea that atheists are privileged is false. We're still a pretty distrusted group in the United States. So, as you pointed out, the dichotomy is between Christianity and secularism, not Christianity and atheism. And we're not advocating, like I said before, for atheism to be the dominant religion of our republic or the guiding principle of our republic. That would be absurd. We can't be because we have no tenets. But we do want the government to be secular as our founders intended. And I think that we can come to advocating for policies that help everyone and acknowledge that painful history through our secular work and just being human and finding common ground.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, one of the responsibilities, and I think you see this when you look at some of the early letters from the founding fathers, particularly from Washington and Jefferson, which is this intent that they were speaking from a particular perspective, that part of the burden of entering as you are into the public square is taking on the responsibility to make room for people who are not like you and that don't share your beliefs. From my religious perspective, the idea of the free will is very important. The idea that we should not have a more limited perspective than God does about who is included, and the freedom that they have, and the dignity that's involved in allowing people the freedom of religion, freedom of belief, and free access to the public square in order to share those beliefs. And so I think that's that stewardship of responsibility to not just rhetorically make these claims, but to actually leverage your place in the public square to make sure there's room for others. I've done some work. Religious freedom has become a much more partisan concept over the last decade, to be sure. And in Christian circles, concerns, some of which are legitimate, some of which are not, and are sort of politically motivated around religious freedom for Christians have risen. But one thing I'd point out to especially conservative religious audiences, or conservative Christian audiences, would be that it's very difficult to advocate for your rights to worship and free exercise as you see fit if you're protesting the mosque that's opening down the street the next week. which is exactly what we saw in Tennessee. That would be the exact, that would be the case of using privilege, of standing in society, not to open up opportunity, but actually to reinforce privilege. And that's something that we need to fight against. And I would argue that there are all of the resources necessary within the Christian faith to advocate for pluralism for all faiths and none.
Thank you. Thank you both. So the issues of hypocrisy have been rife in this nation from the outset and the founding of the nation. Can both of you speak? You both have referenced early periods of founding fathers. Can both of you kind of talk about why you think the founding fathers did think it was best to have a secular nation, and if that truly ever happened?
Well, certainly they thought about it. When they were drafting our Constitution, they had the history of theocratic government behind them. And they understood what that meant and what that did to religious liberty. When they were drafting the Constitution, I mean, they were very intentional in a lot of what they did. And I think that it is really important to note that they did conspicuously leave out religious terms in our governing document. There's no mention of any deity in our Constitution, much less Jesus Christ. In fact, our Constitution only mentions religion 3 times, and every time it is to exclude something or prohibit something, so banning a test for religious office, prohibiting the government from aligning with one religion over another or religion over non-religion. Our founding fathers really wanted to protect the freedom of thought. They really did understand that religious freedom can flourish if we have a secular form of government. It was a truly unique American idea. To the question of whether that has come true, I think for the most part, yes. We are still forming that perfect union, and we're not there. And obviously, with 91% of our legislators being Christian, and the country growing more and more diverse, there's still a lot of work to do. But I think this American experiment has been working. Do I think we could do better? Absolutely. I don't think we're there yet. And we've had a lot of times in our history when religion was to our detriment. Passing the Civil Rights Acts, a lot of the litigation that went around in the 50s and the 60s, some of the arguments in those cases were based on religion, and those didn't stand. So I think we're making progress. I don't know if we are truly a secular society, but we're as close as we possibly can be, and we have to work hard to keep it that way.
Yeah, I think the founding fathers intended to have a nation that did not establish one religion over another at the federal level. It's important to note that the Establishment Clause did not apply to states. So at our founding, we had states that had established churches. And so depending on how, if they intended a purely secular society, their intentionality might not have been as clear as it might have been. I think there have been ebbs and flows, right? I mean, the way that religion has been, like so many other cultural phenomena, the way that religion is tied up in political movements is very interesting. So, for instance, the classic example of In God We Trust being a reaction to communism, and the way that religion was mobilized in that way to send a political and sort of foreign policy message and a statement of national identity is very interesting, and I think we could have a very healthy, I'm not particularly committed to that debate, but I think it's a very interesting one to see both the ways in which religious influence has been. I mean, I think that's the key crux of what we're talking about here. I think the difference between a secular government and a government that's free from religious influence are two very different things. The latter was clearly not intended by the founding fathers, by virtue of how they acted, by virtue of what followed. But a government in which certain religions, including certain Christian denominations, would not have the imprimatur of the government, of the Constitution. That's clear. That has served us well. As Rebecca mentioned, it's a common and I think a right observation to make that our system of religious freedom, at least for our first 2.5 centuries of existence, has facilitated religious growth and vibrancy, not limited it. And that's a tradition that I think has been a gift to much of the world.
Well, let me follow up on that. Walk us through how a person who has strong religious conviction comes into public office. So as I told you, I study race, and part of that is bias. So is it your contention that a person who has these strong convictions can come into a public office and adjudicate, litigate, come up with law, legislate? And so how does that happen without him acting based on his own religious bias in ways that might be harmful to other people out there? And I guess for you, a similar question would be, so you have secularists, how can we be sure that those, because I don't think that, I think you're right, there may not be tenets, but I don't think anybody would argue that some of the origins of secularism/atheism also have theoretical/philosophical understandings from which they pull as well, right? So it's not like, oh, I don't believe in God, so therefore I don't have my biases. No, they do. So how would you say a politician would do that?
I'll just respond quickly to say, part of this is to return to my opening statement, which is it's very important to, there are a lot of different motivations for bad policy. A lot of our political process is debating about that policy. And so to cut out religious motivations for bad policy seems attractive because it's bad policy. So if you could cut it off at the beginning, why not? But that is cutting off the debate before you have it. It's kind of a manipulative sort of tactic. It's part of the public policy process. Now, what I'd say is, and again, I think the legal parameters around this are not quite clear, particularly around the message. There are parameters around the messenger, and hopefully we'll talk about the Johnson Amendment and some of those issues as this conversation goes on. But regarding the message, people can use all types of justifications and arguments in the public square for policy, even public policymakers. We see it now. There is no court case against Barack Obama for saying that part of the reason why he wants to pursue efforts to restrict climate change is because he believes we're called to steward God's creation. No one is filing a lawsuit against Barack Obama for justifying in part his public policy approach on a belief that you're stewarding God's creation. And so the important thing in the public policy debate is that we have the opportunity to openly debate these ideas. And as a matter of sort of practicality, we can urge and hold public policy makers accountable for arguing in the public square in a way that's generally accessible, that is not manipulative, that doesn't simply refer to the authority of religious tradition to sort of bypass reasoned debate. But that is largely up to the citizenry to have political standards for engagement and to enforce those through democratic will and democratic process.
Thank you.
So if we're looking at policy making and legislation, of course people are going to have bias and they're going to have motivations based on their personal experiences. Everybody has that. But, you know, if your policy stance is based solely on religion, then that, and you're a lawmaker, you're a legislature, then you're not basing it on we the people, and that's a problem. That's not okay in our secular republic. But that's not to say that you can't have the same policy stances as somebody who would be Christian. You know, I don't agree that people should steal. I think there should be criminal penalties for that. But it's not based on the 10 Commandments for me. It's just based on being a decent human being and being able to live together. So if it's truly the same policy stance, there really isn't a problem. When it becomes problematic is when those beliefs and those biases start having an adverse impact or effect on others' rights. You know, we as secularists, we care about these wild and wacky religious beliefs when they affect others. Those beliefs are problematic when they get policymakers to ignore evidence. You know, we're not going to take care of global warming because, you know, the end is nigh, and there's an afterlife. Or, you know, I'm not going to teach evolution because I believe that that doesn't exist and the earth is 6,000 years old. Well, that becomes a problem. But like I said before, there are some policy stances that may be motivated by religion, but can also be motivated by other things like just being a good person and wanting to be able to live together.
Yeah, so I just, right again, I'd want to identify with the, which is a very real thing, this sort of, this strain of religious thought that is sort of, we're just passing through, and so what happens here doesn't really matter, and that, but the identifiable problem with that view in a political setting is not that it's religiously motivated. In a public argument, the argument would be made is that that is detrimental to the good of the people, that's not an argument focused on the common good. To focus on its religious motivation, I think can sometimes turn the debate sideways a bit. Certainly there are secular motivations for bad policy, and we, I think we'd be misled to attack this the secular motivation of bad policy. I think we need to deal with the actual policy arguments and the views that are advocated, and I think we get into very tricky territory when we try and identify and demean the source, particularly when we're talking in a religious context or a religious context of that policy view. That seems to me to go to be contrary to the idea of a secular public square if we're putting on the table the fact that a view is dispensationalist versus, I don't know, a theological view that we find more pleasing.
I just wanted to follow up too, because when we're talking about motivation here, Michael had mentioned, you know, that legally it doesn't really matter. I do want to say that it does. When laws are passed based on religious motivation, that does come into play when you're looking at an Establishment Clause claim. To uphold that government action, it has to have a secular purpose. If you can find that there is a religious motivation behind it, that law will be struck down. And this is really prominent in laws like Good Friday closings, which I don't know if you guys know a lot about, but in the state of Wisconsin, we used to have a law that on Good Friday, all government offices had to close between 12 and 3 for the purposes of going to worship services. That law is clearly motivated by religion and actually compelling people to go to religious services in some weird way. That was struck down as unconstitutional. So sometimes religious motivation in policy stances do matter, particularly when you're passing legislation. So I just didn't want everybody to leave thinking there's no legal harm here. There can be.
Thank you. So I have a question. So Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama, George Bush, and Donald Trump all talk about religion differently, right? Some are scary as hell. Some won't say who. And some are more pleasing and a bit more muted, and some are non-communicative. So the question is, and this is one of the questions forwarded to you before, do references to religion and political rhetoric help or hamper proper governance?
It's an interesting question, and it's one a lot of people are thinking about right now, not just in the American context, but particularly in the Western world. I think, again, I'd return to the idea of the intent and the nature of the appeal. I think to ask, I think the question of whether religious arguments help or hurt needs a little more nuance. So there's a professor at Yale, I believe he's not a religious guy, Phil Gorski, who just wrote a book commenting on one of the reasons for increasing polarization he identifies as the loss of civil religion in America. And he says that because he says that we've lost a shared moral vocabulary that we used to share, regardless of our particular faith backgrounds, that our public discourse has become, there's no sort of moral authority upon which you can appeal, and no basic moral assumptions that serve as a backdrop of our public debates. So that could be an open question, but there are reasonable people, both of a religious background and of a secular background, who have argued that, again, whether they're religious or not, that actually religion is a helpful resource in public debates. But again, I'd focus on what is the nature of that appeal. It is the nature, I think, for a long time, a lot of the discomfort with religious appeals, particularly among younger generations, particularly among my generation, is that we've endured an era when religion was used as a wedge and as a weapon, as opposed to something that was meant to bring people together, that was meant to appeal to higher aspirations. And so we have a public discourse right now where I think initially the right and now the left have all these sort of sly, cutting religious references that are meant to really distract from the public policy issue. And so from the left, I'd use the example of the whole thoughts and prayers debate. Thoughts and prayers used to be something that politicians from both parties used openly, but at some point, Democrats kind of decided not just to critique Republicans' inaction on gun control, but to also add this layer of they're all religious nuts, and the reason why they're not acting is because they're too busy praying to their spaghetti monster in the sky as opposed to actually acting. And there's a sub-political appeal there. I also was working for President Obama for his re-election in 2012, and there was a Republican set a trap for all the previous party platforms. The Democrats and the Republicans flipped up and down between like 2 and 4 mentions of God in their platforms, like back from the 80s. I think the most was like 6 or 7 mentions of God in the platform. In 2012, Republicans identified this, and you probably remember this. All of a sudden, Republicans' mentions of God shot up to 12 in this platform, in their platform in 2012. Democrats, in 2008, they had 1 mention, and just in edits, the 1 mention got out. And so there was this whole debate about Democrats taking God out of America. Mitt Romney gave a statement saying that I will not let, I'm paraphrasing here, although the last clause is something embedded in my brain. He said something like, I will not let them take God out of our country, off our currency, and I will not let them take God out of my heart. And I'm like, that wasn't really part of the campaign strategy. Really not. God can stay in your heart, Mitt. But that was to appeal, again, not just on a policy level, but to use religion as this sort of identity wedge, and that's something we need to be really careful about. And when we're using religious arguments in public, we need to make sure we're appealing to ideas and not just sort of tribal appeals.
I mean, I can assure you that even when the Democrats went down to the one reference or what have you, they did not lose God. One of the things that is interesting after Trump was elected...
I made sure of that, Rebecca.
One of the things that people mentioned to me after Trump was elected was, wow, you must be so busy, you must have job security. And which, yes, is true, but it really wasn't going to be that much different under Clinton in terms of religious references. She was still going to say God bless America after every single State of the Union or presidential address. She was going to use the So Help Me God, when she took the oath. That was not going to change. But so to the question, I do think that it hampers good governance. We kind of alluded to these references to religion in political rhetoric are often viewed as unifying. God bless America, that seems to unify people at the end of the State of the Union, even if you may have disagreed with some of the stuff that was said. Invoking scripture during times of national tragedy, it is seen as a way of comforting a grieving nation. But I think we have seen in the last couple of years, or the last number of decades, that it's not unifying. It is in fact divisive, because it does signal to those who don't subscribe to this majority religion that they are not part of that political community. For example, we talked about In God We Trust. My bosses at FFRF like to say, in God some of us trust. It may seem silly and benign to be upset about that type of rhetoric, but when your job is to represent a collective group of people, or you're seeking to have that job, then you need to be truly unifying and understand that there are people who don't subscribe to the majority religion. They may be practicing minority religions, or they may not be practicing at all. We are derived from we the people, not we the Christians, we the Muslims, we the atheists. And I think that injecting religion into those types of political rhetoric is dangerous. And it is especially dangerous now that we're becoming more and more religiously diverse, and you're looking at the younger generations being more and more non-religious or unaffiliated. And I just go back to the fact that it's unnecessary. Sort of like that example of the coach praying before a football game. You can go and just play football. You don't need to appeal to God before you do that. And it's the same in the legislative context. You are perfectly able to propose legislation, pass laws, or comfort a grieving nation without those references. It is possible.
Thank you. So some of them, this is a question off script. Some of the minoritized religions across Europe practiced something where sons would be allowed to marry mothers, okay? Now, this is a practice that probably most Americans would find repulsive, right? And so if it is truly we the people, or if it's we the Christian people, because that's often the unspoken subtext, right? We the people, we the Christian people. So how would we react? So I want to interrogate a bit more this notion of, well, we don't have anything except we the people and ourselves, and we can lead this way forward, yet there are all of these invisibilized moralities that are never spoken, but that people in a particular place, because of their common history, bring to policy conversations and policy discussions. And so, for example, on Eid, Muslims don't get an Eid off, but we're off every Christmas and we're off every Easter. So we're off every Sunday, right, on a weekly basis. And so what I'm trying to get to again is sort of this hypocrisy that really goes back to the origin of this nation, that certain people are in privileged positions and others are left out. So what are we truly talking about here when we're really talking about bringing these invisibilized positionalities into the public space? Like, how can we assure that people like me are not going to be left out? What are the checks and balances? How can we roll things back that have already been done for 400 years? Those kind of questions.
Yeah, so this is very important. So secular is not neutral, at least in certain applications of it. I'll give you a good example. There was a Supreme Court case that involved Abercrombie, and a female employee got hired and then came to work, and her employer discovered that she wore a hijab. If you read the oral arguments in this case, it's amazing. Abercrombie advanced the case that their aesthetic was so defined, so particular, that it precluded the hijab. I don't know if you've been in Abercrombie and Fitch lately. It's not that great stuff. Hijab really kind of, I think, raises the quality, not lowers it. But this was the case that they advanced, and the argument was no. Even though you have installed a policy that is ostensibly generally applicable, so we have these clothing guidelines, and they don't just count up the hijab, but they discount all this other stuff, some of it religious, some of it not. The Supreme Court said, actually, no, you can't fire an employee that you've hired simply because of her free exercise of her beliefs. This is sort of a fundamental thing. We've seen this go awry in other places that also uphold a certain conception of the separation of church and state, like France, where they've decided in a reaction in part to terrorism, and I think a frustration that secularized values of human rights that have religious origins or a draw from religious traditions, their attempt to secularize those ideas, it's not quite as compelling. And so they've, in the rise of Islamic terrorism, they've now started instituting things like burqa bans on beaches, and that is claiming to uphold a national identity, but actually, when it's enforced, tends to punish some populations, particularly religious populations, more than others. And that's what we have to be wary of in the American context, as well as abroad.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with a lot of what Michael said. I think the crux of the issue is just making sure that religion isn't relevant to your political standing within the community. So you can't enforce policies that, prohibit you from wearing that hijab at work. I also think that we do have the accommodation for days off in minority religions. I like Christmas off too, but I don't think we need to have it off. So, I think there are ways that we can change what we've done. Just because it's tradition doesn't necessarily mean it needs to stay that way. There were a lot of really awful traditions in the United States that we stopped, and we're still working on correcting. So I think the biggest thing is just to work towards not making your religion relevant to your political standing here in the community.
Thank you. And thank you both for the first segment of this. And at this point, we are going to turn the questioning over to the audience. And so we have a number of people, there are baskets at the end of each row. If you have a question, please go ahead and write it on a piece of paper if you haven't already. And one of the folks up in the audience will collect that, and we'll try to bring multiple questions that sound sort of similar together, and we'll begin asking those questions. So I think we have our first set already ready to go.
All right, our first question is, if having a religious perspective never changes what a politician's policies would have otherwise been, it might be argued that religion never meaningfully entered the political process. As a result, doesn't religion entering meaningfully in the political process require contradicting the secular status quo?
It's a great question. I would argue that religious perspectives should not aim for distinctiveness. That's actually a bad. If you're actually reacting solely to what the status quo is, and assuming that all of the status quo, that all of what your neighbors support is somehow antithetical to your religious belief, that's not something that's based in my tradition. I'm not a Reformed. I don't come out of the Reformed tradition, but there's an idea that has other sort of phrasings throughout other sort of Christian streams of thought. But in the Reformed tradition, it's called the idea of common grace. And this is the idea that even those who do not share the same theological convictions as Christians actually have a lot to contribute to the public good. And that is actually a Christian idea, that actually good can be found everywhere because God is everywhere. And so I think it's a really great question. I think the Christian aim, and you know, speaking with humility, I think the religious aim should not be distinctiveness, but integrity. And that's what we should be thinking about in public policy and all of life, not just a reactionary approach.
I mean, we'll go back to what I said earlier. You know, if your religious motivation is prompting you to pass legislation that is promoting your personal religious beliefs to the adverse effect against others' constitutional rights, then that does contradict our secular republic. And there are ways, obviously, to address that. We have elections in this country. So if you see that that's happening and this person has been in office for so long, you can vote them out.
Thank you. Next question. Sorry.
Without appeal to a higher authority, morality, it seems to me, is based on a majority consensus. How is policy based solely on a majority, in parentheses, secular consensus, different from policy based solely on religious beliefs in a society that is majority religious?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the philosopher Oliver O'Donovan talks about the idea that liberal democracy actually bears the crater marks of Christianity. In other words, he's saying that the very idea of liberal democracy is not opposed to religious traditions, but actually is impacted in large ways by them. And Nick Wolterstorff, a professor at Yale, has made the extensive argument that the idea of human rights is actually derived from religious tradition, and secular and religious scholars, after literally centuries of trying as a post-Enlightenment project to sort of locate a rational, secular view of human rights, there are cases, but the grounding isn't strong enough. And so, I think this idea of, so one of the critical contentions here is whether religious tradition is just a set of family tradition and folk way, or actually a claim to ultimate reality. And if you don't think religious belief in general, and specific religious traditions, are farcical and have no bearing on reality, then it's much easier to make the claim that religion should never intersect with politics, because politics is about the concrete and material, and religion is, at best, a helpful set of folk ways to help people get along. But religious people actually believe that religion is not just a set of folkways. It actually bears on reality and actually has lived out implications not just for how we pray and where we go on Sundays or Saturdays or any other day of the week, but it has to do with how we live our lives and actually what's best for society. And that's what I mean when I say to preempt that by disallowing religious viewpoints from the public square is actually to end the debate before it begins.
So I was not a philosophy major, but as a constitutional attorney, whenever anybody talks about, well, the majority of us are religious people, my ears perk up, because we have this sense in the United States that, majority rules, and that's not always true. Obviously, from the last election, the popular vote didn't carry the day. That's not how we work, and that's not how the Constitution operates. Particularly the Bill of Rights. It was drafted to protect the minority from the majority, and that's what its purpose was. So I feel that our system of government, while the people who make up that system of government may be very religious people, our systems and our institutions themselves do have these checks and balances to make sure that the minority rights are not adversely affected. Of course, as we've talked about earlier this evening, that hasn't always been the case. Obviously, when they drafted the Bill of Rights, there was slavery, women couldn't vote. There were a lot of stains on our history, and we're working to correct those. But we really need to dispel this myth that 99% of us believe in God, so therefore, we can have religion all over the place. It's not true. That's not how our system of government was created.
Thank you.
So that religion can participate fully in the public square, should some real estate holdings owned by churches be subject to taxation? Why or why not?
Yeah, this might be a really good opportunity to talk about the Johnson Amendment. And this is, so it's really interesting. I think we'll find agreement here. So for those of you who don't know, the Johnson Amendment is, I think, a 1960s provision that basically says, and only one of us up here is a lawyer, and it's not me. But basically, it says that churches can participate, that they could have views on, and nonprofits can have views on policy issues. They could speak to moral questions. They can't get involved in electoral campaigns. And if they do, the penalty is not that the church gets shut down or that the government comes in. It's that they can't retain their nonprofit status. This was a relatively settled question. I've been someone who's worked not just with liberal religious groups, but with very conservative religious groups for the last decade. No one was talking about, the Johnson Amendment was not, if you look at the priorities of, for instance, the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the Johnson Amendment was not on their list of priorities. It became a priority over the last 2 years at the grassroots level and for the Republican Party when Donald Trump became its nominee. And Donald Trump put the Johnson Amendment on the table for public conversation, not out of a sophisticated view of how the Johnson Amendment was contrary to the Constitution, but because it tapped into a very important political message for him, which was, Christians, you feel under attack in this country. The reason why you're not winning all the public debates is because of this 1960s era provision. I'm going to get rid of it, and we're going to make America great again. I'm a strong believer in the Johnson Amendment. I view the Johnson Amendment as the other side of the coin of the agreement that we have in this country, that the government doesn't have the right to come into churches and tell you what to preach, doesn't have the right to come in and look through your sermons or determine the ecclesiastical structure of your organizations. And churches, if they expect to maintain their nonprofit status, just agree not to tell people who to vote for. It doesn't mean that churches can't say, I think poverty is an important issue, you should vote for, poverty should be a part of your voting consideration. So much is allowable, except for telling people to vote for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And that's an important provision to keep. I think church exempt status is very important in this country, not because it violates the separation of church and state, but because it upholds it. Because it says that the government has nowhere near the financial holdings of churches. Once you allow the government into churches, or once you allow churches directly into ordering their people who to vote for, then you start seeing a fraying of the separation between church and state.
So yeah, we're veering a little bit with the Johnson Amendment, but like...
Do I have Freedom from Religion Foundation on record in opposition to the Johnson Amendment?
No,
this is
no.
huge.
No, the original question was about taxing churches. So I will get to that original question in a moment. But no, the Johnson Amendment, I mean, I've spent the greater part of this last year lobbying Congress to make sure it does not get repealed. It is a very common sense prohibition on electioneering by religious organizations, but not just religious organizations, all 501c3s. So FFRF is a 501c3 organization, and we are also not allowed to engage in partisan political campaigns. So I can't write an article for our publication, Free Thought Today, and say everybody should vote for Bernie Sanders. I can't do that. That would strip us of our tax-exempt status. And just like us, churches, pastors are prevented from doing that as well. What the Johnson Amendment doesn't prohibit is lobbying on issues. So we can talk about all sorts of issues with our representatives. I'm just gonna, oh yeah, my list here. So it's important to note that 501c3s and religious organizations and our organizations, we're not prohibited from engaging in any kind of campaign activity. We can engage in nonpartisan election activity. So I can do a get out the vote drive. In fact, the Secular Coalition for America is going to do that this year with the Secular Values Voter Initiative. We can have candidates come and speak at our events. So long as you invite all of them, they don't have to say yes, but as long as you made the effort, you can have a candidate come and speak at one of your events. And you can draft voter guides, as long as they're all done in a nonpartisan manner. And of course, if the church really does, or if FFRF really wanted to endorse candidates or oppose candidates, because it's not just endorsing. We have a lot of people who are saying, you know, I don't want you to vote for Hillary. There were actually a couple of churches last year where pastors were like, actually, none of the above. They're both evil. Don't vote for either of them. We did turn those churches into the IRS as well. But if they want to do stuff like that, they don't have to be C3s. They can just pay taxes. Alternatively, they could also form a 501c4 organization, which would allow them to engage in unlimited lobbying and also be able to endorse or oppose candidates actively. But back to the question of taxing churches in general, yes, I think that they should be taxed. There is a lot of real estate owned by churches in this country. I don't even know the numbers because we don't have those numbers. Churches don't have to file any sort of forms with the government to let us know what their finances are. All other 501c3 organizations like ours have to file Form 990s. They are very onerous tax papers that indicate the money coming in, the money going out. And everybody can look those up and figure out how much money FFRF has. Churches don't have to do that. And if we were to repeal the Johnson Amendment, I do think that churches would become these huge financial black holes, particularly for political contributions, and there are problems with campaign finance regulations for that. But aside from the Johnson Amendment, there are a lot of real estate owned by churches that are currently being unused. In fact, in Madison, Wisconsin, one of the cathedrals burned down like 10 or 15 years ago. And it's this prime location, downtown Madison, and they have not used that spot since. So if you're going to have real estate and be a religious organization, you have to use it for a religious purpose. The Catholic Church was not doing that. So the city of Madison actually made them pay taxes. They sued, saying it was a religious liberty issue, and they lost. Then they converted the space into this weird Stations of the Cross park that nobody went to. But it was really, really inventive way to say, well, now we're using it for this religious purpose. But I think that we should tax churches.
Thank you.
Michael, you mentioned that there might be secular motivations for bad policy. Could you elaborate or possibly give an example of this? Also, Rebecca, if a policy is created, with only religion in mind, but still is found to have a strictly positive impact, would you be for or against this?
Yeah, so I just want to, I'm not sure if I misspoke. My argument is that religious motivations can be part of an argument, particularly part of the public record for an argument for a policy. But policy should not be made on, again, appeals to religious authority alone, which is not to preclude the inclusion of religiously motivated values. On the question of how could secular values motivate bad policy, Stalin, I think we have a wave of, I think America has long struggled with a sort of a view that of radical individualism that has sometimes been advanced by people who claim, and who am I to judge, who share a religious faith, but there is a sort of nihilistic sort of motivation that says that actually the government should not be involved, and society should not be involved in caring for one another, because the value of natural selection means that those who deserve to make it will make it, and those who deserve to fail will fail. I mean, just look at Congress every day. There are secular motivations for bad policy made all of the time, and so I think that's pretty clear. My argument is that what's bad about secular motivations leading to bad policy is not that they're secular, but that they lead to bad policy, and the same is true for religious motivations that lead to bad policy.
So I've been spending this time trying to figure out what sort of policy created solely on the basis of religion that has a positive impact. Not to say that there's never been that, but it's kind of, I mean, obviously we would support something like that, but I would default to, if in the legislative findings of that policy, you're saying you're doing it because of Jesus, then it is subject to challenge. But I mean, obviously if they have positive impacts, they're also probably based on commonalities from humanism that we can derive. So, but if you have a specific example, that'd be great, but I think that we would support something like that.
What is it that makes religiously motivated policies particularly dangerous as opposed to policies motivated by a different privileged view, like individualism?
Well, I don't know if it's a unique power solely to religion. I think there are, I haven't done a compare and contrast. I think there are probably other motivations that have equal or similar power to religion, but religion does historically have a capacity to direct people's wills in a powerful way. And so religious motivations, especially depending on the level of authority and imposition that comes behind them, can be detrimental. Again, if not in unique ways, certainly using resources that are available to religion and religious authority, which is why sort of the three principles I laid out at the beginning are so of the way in which religious motivations are a part of our public square. Again, while we can't legally guard those boundaries, it's important to have in mind and through social means and through political means enforce healthy dialogue that, again, doesn't use religion solely as an appeal to authority to shut off debate, but as an interpretive tool to enhance and develop public discussion.
What makes it dangerous? I think we're seeing what makes it so dangerous in the way things are playing out currently. And we've seen how it has been dangerous in the past. I alluded to civil rights cases from the 1950s and the 1960s, where they were arguing, we have the right to discriminate because the Bible tells us that they are an inferior race. That's a dangerous position to have. And we're seeing that now with a lot of the religious liberty cases that are coming before the courts. You have the Hobby Lobby decision, where Hobby Lobby is denying contraceptive coverage to its employees. It's dangerous because you are affecting somebody else's right. And you're looking at the Kim Davises of the world who decide my religion says that I don't have to give you a marriage license because I believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. That's a dangerous position, particularly when you're in a position of power like that, and you're controlling the fate of other people. To these bakery cases where the cake shops are refusing to bake cakes for same-sex couples. The one that's before the Supreme Court right now, Masterpiece Cake Shop, the baker in that case said that he didn't believe Jesus would make them a bed. He was a carpenter, and he doesn't think that Jesus would make that same-sex couple a bed. So therefore, he doesn't have to bake them a cake. These are dangerous things, especially when we're living in a pluralistic society. So what makes it dangerous? Those examples that I just gave you.
Michael, can you respond?
Yeah. I just add that again, we probably have a disagreement on a couple of the cases that were raised, but in general, even if you agree that those actions are problematic, they're problematic because the actions are problematic, not because of the motivation for them. If Kim Davis was motivated by a secular motivation of opposition to gay marriage, I'm not sure how the level of negativity is helped by the fact that it would be a secular motivation. And so again, I think we need to acknowledge the history of, and again, maybe not the unique, but certainly the potential of religion to be used as a motivation in ways that other sources are not. But we also need to make sure that we're not conflating the worth of religious motivation with just policies we don't like.
I just want to respond to the Kim Davis thing, because if she was motivated by purely secularist viewpoints, she would have been fired. That's just a fact.
Yeah, so I think, so I don't know, that's an interesting thing to consider. I think what's also important to consider is that religion does have special protection in the Constitution. And so we could maybe have an argument about the scope of free exercise cases. Of course, the case that you mentioned, the HHS mandate case, that was a case that was one. I believe Kim Davis's case. I don't know if it ever reached the court, but I believe it was adjudicated so that she was not able to persist in carrying out her beliefs. But I mean, I think it's a vibrant conversation to be had about whether religious freedom is too broadly applied. But again, I'd return to the fact that the source there is not whether religious motivation is a problem, but whether our laws are a problem.
Thank you. But before you do that, let me ask Rebecca, could you respond more directly to Michael and him saying that if it's a religious motivation versus a secular motivation, neither one are problematic? Because I would imagine that historically the religious motivation had something to do with the founding fathers. I'm just not following the argument how you would respond to that fact that, okay, you have secular motivations, I have religious motivations, so what do you make of that was the big deal. How would you respond to that? Because he said that a number of times tonight.
Yeah, I'm not really following that entirely either. You know, I think that I feel that this idea of secular motivations is sort of a fiction because, I mean, again, like we're talking about secularism as if it is some sort of religion, almost in a sense, and I don't believe that that is also true. So I guess I might be just as confused as you are, not really following. But I do think that in the instance of Kim Davis, you know, she was motivated by her religion. She was very vocal about that. And she didn't lose her job. She wasn't punished or anything. If I were in that position, I would have gotten in trouble for that. And then I think anybody else would have. Yes, religion has some protections in our government, but I think that is also, this is just illustrative of the problem.
So one of the things that I think I heard you mention, and I don't want to misstate, is this notion of, I think you said radical individualism, right, as being aligned with secular belief. In other words, as I've read it, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I wouldn't want to attribute it solely. It would be a school of thought that could arise.
Because as I've read on this, it's I can do whatever I would like to do as long as it does not infringe upon what you would like to do, right? And so I think that would be, for example, something that would be diametrically opposed to a religious point of view. So I don't know. I hope that we can come back to it maybe, but I'd like to take that apart a bit. But this is not my turn. It's the audience's turn, so let's move on.
If we, as Michael suggests, allow people to bring their religious perspectives into the discussion, how do we prevent the discussion or the decision-making process from devolving into a question of who has greater membership or following? In other words, how do we avoid religious majoritarianism?
Yeah, I think in the same way that we prevent majoritarianism of any other kind. I mean, the alternative is to, again, somehow artificially impose on our political dialogue that one set of motivations, one set of people are the kinds of motivations that just can't be a part of the. I don't understand how you have a participatory form of government if you're telling people that because of the source of your beliefs, you simply cannot have a voice with your fellow citizens. And so I think there are all kinds of things that are checks and balances on majoritarian rule, though I would say within the confines of the Bill of Rights, of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, I mean, legislation passes the House by getting a majority of the vote. Legislation passes the Senate, well, not by a majority of the vote, but 60 votes. And so there is a tension inherent within our system of government that was attempted to, that the Bill of Rights tries to address to prevent exactly that majoritarian rule. Well, what I would suggest is that again, to identify, I mean, I'm not sure, I hope I'm communicating clearly. My argument about religious versus secular motivation is that if I disagree with cutting the social safety net, I don't care. It is much less important to me whether the people trying to cut the social safety net are doing so out of religious motivation or a secular motivation. My problem is that they're trying to cut the social safety net. And a political, pluralistic, secular form of government, if people agree with my policy positions, I'm happy to have them as allies. So that's what I mean by, in politics, what matters is the ideas, less so the motivation for those ideas in the very practical sense of lawmaking. When we look at the abolition of slavery, we're not looking at how valid it is depending on what motivated each lawmaker that voted for it and each person who voted for those lawmakers. We're looking at what the actual policy was that passed. And again, I just want to say that to point at religious motivations as the problem can have the effect of turning a policy discussion sideways so that the debate becomes not about the ideas, but about whether you like religion or not. And that, to me, is a real threat against a pluralistic dialogue. If our debates become all about subtext, about like in thoughts and prayers, like in I will not take God out of my heart, becomes about what tribe are you with? Are you religious or are you not?
So I think, how do we prevent religious majoritarianism? Like Michael said, our system of government is designed to prevent that. Whether we've been successful is an open question. But I think we also have to remember that we as citizens have duties and obligations to be good citizens and ensure the progress of our republic. So to that end, it is things like education and sitting down with people who have divergent views and learning about their experiences and their backgrounds. Forums like tonight are incredibly important and helpful. And really just focusing on building our collective empathy for each other. We're all in this together, and we need to understand each other a little bit better. And once we start doing that, we do prevent this oppressive majoritarianism.
Well, it shouldn't have come as any surprise. We have far more good questions than we have time to answer them. And so I would encourage you all, as you're thinking about where to go from this space, definitely be checking out the roundtable discussions where you can discuss all these questions. We saved them. We haven't thrown them away. You can very much come back to them. In just a moment here, we are going to be closing, but I did want to spend some time, give each of the speakers here just a moment to give some perhaps concluding thoughts, 10 minutes total, and before we wrap up here. Thank you.
I'm probably not going to take 10 minutes, but I do want to close with some parting thoughts. First, American government and religion's relationship with our government begins and ends, in my opinion, with the Constitution. And like I said at the outset, and repeatedly throughout our discussion here tonight, our Constitution is godless. It omits references to specific deities or Jesus Christ, and only mentions religion a few times. Our founders understood that freedom of thought was paramount and that the separation between religion and government was crucial to that principle, freedom of thought, to be absolute. And again, to be clear, there can be no religious freedom without our government being free from religion. And we talked a lot about tonight, does religious belief exempt the believer from laws. We kind of started touching on that when we started talking about Kim Davis and Hobby Lobby and things like that. In other words, does having a particular belief give someone the right to act on that belief simply because the belief is religious, no matter what the impact is on others? And I want you guys to know that the right to believe and the right to act are very distinct. The right to believe is absolute. You can be free to believe in anything you want, but your action is not absolute. There's an old legal adage that your right to swing your fist begins or ends where my nose begins. So your rights end when others' rights begin. And there is no religious right to infringe on the rights of others. In particular, the First Amendment's protection of religion has always been understood as the right to unfettered thought. The freedom to believe whatever religion we choose or none at all, without government interference of any kind. But the right to believe as we choose has never encompassed a way to act as we choose. Never has a citizen's right to free exercise of religion under the First Amendment, let alone any corporation or commercial business, been understood to include the ability to engage in any conduct that infringes on the rights of others. And I think I will close with that.
Great. Well, again, thank you for facilitating this, and thank you to Rebecca. I just want to close with a few quick thoughts. We spent most of our time today talking about the permissibility of religious perspectives and how those perspectives should be expressed. I have argued that in a society like ours, in a system of government like ours, it would be, in the words of President Obama, a practical absurdity to ask people of faith by virtue of the source of their knowledge to leave that knowledge outside of our public conversations. Once in the public square, while there are few actual legal constraints on religious expression, I believe healthy religious expression will be characterized by authenticity, an interpretive or argumentative approach rather than a declarative, the Bible says so kind of approach, and that religious expression will be other-centered. But I want to just close by urging you to consider that a religious perspective might not just be permissible in public, that it might not just be possible to express religious perspectives with care for the good of others, but that a religious perspective might actually be true. This time, right now, is the best opportunity to consider the viability of religious knowledge as knowledge of what is true. You're here at the University of Minnesota to learn, to consider what is possible, what is good, what is beautiful, what is true. And you should feel prompted to do this when it comes to religion. There was much talk last week about the second great controversy of the Super Bowl, the first being, of course, they did not feature the Minnesota Vikings. Many pointed out that in the very sermon that Dodge used in the advertisement to sell their trucks, Martin Luther King critiqued car advertisements. Did you all see this ad, this Dodge Ram ad that used a sermon MLK gave to sell Dodge Ram trucks? In the same sermon, Martin Luther King critiqued car advertisements, which is just one of those beautiful ironies. King critiqued car advertisements out of his knowledge of what was edifying, what was loving, and his knowledge was distinctly, inescapably Christian. His sermon was on what he called the drum major instinct, and in it he contemplated what true greatness is. And after opening with a paragraph of scripture recounting Jesus' disciples asking him who he would exalt among them, who would achieve greatness, King affirms their ambition. But drawing on the life and words of Jesus, King argued that Jesus gave us a new norm of greatness. That's a quote from the sermon. Unlike the greatness of this world, King argued, a vision of greatness that King argued promotes social disintegration, economic inequality, war, racism, and other social and political evils. Jesus, King said, showed what agape love that wills the good of others, looks like. And King argued, Jesus enables us to love in that way. He offers that kind of knowledge to us through experience with him. And whether our politics is amenable to this kind of knowledge or not, and certainly politics was not amenable to the kind of knowledge that King brought into the public square, King believed it was true, no matter what the politics said. King believed that Jesus' knowledge was more fundamental than what was accepted in politics at the moment. Outside of us reaching agreement on that point tonight, what I'm glad about is the idea that we can bring our whole selves to public forums like this, and yes, even into our politics, and talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you.